Okay, it's all yours, Dianne.
Okay. All right. Today is Sunday, October 6th, 2024. My name is Dianne Aprile. My lecture is titled Beauty is Truth, Truth, Beauty, an Exploration of Form and Content in Creative Writing. I'm just thinking should I pin myself, Kathleen? Let's see. Okay.
You don't have to.
Okay. I chose this title, which is a line from John Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn, after a lot of thought about what creative nonfiction means to me as a reader and a writer and a teacher, but also about what I want to convey to you in this lecture to prepare you for the fall residency, since its emphasis is on CNF. So while focusing for decades really on the CNF genre as a writer and a teacher, I've often found myself telling others who ask about it that CNF differs from other nonfiction because of the C at the beginning of it, the creative, the imaginative, the unique perspective, and the elevated craft, another C, that goes with writing it. So think of beauty for a moment, the pleasure and the engagement of art, for example. Then think of truth, the deep authenticity of experience. Then think of these two concepts in juxtaposition to each other, in dialogue with each other. They inform one another. Out of heightened experience, we find truth. In the pursuit of what really happened, we discover beauty. To me, creative nonfiction is where reality and style converge. So today I will be talking about and demonstrating to you how CNF accomplishes this merger. Like fiction in all of its versions, short stories, novels, etc., and like poetry in its various forms, odes, haiku, sonnets, there are many shapes that CNF takes. You will see as I talk about it that I think a lot of them overlap and influence each other, but there are various shapes. And like poetry, that is just one of the things that happens in this particular genre. So we'll look at those and we'll try to understand the breadth and diversity of CNF through this. And hopefully this will encourage you to explore CNF and also to analyze the CNF that we are presented with during this residency. An aside, recently I was at a gathering of people talking about a book, and a poet in the group said she likes to read nonfiction, but doesn't look to it for the beauty of language or the artistry, but just for facts and truth. And so I'll admit to you, I bristled at that, because creative nonfiction to me is the fusion of beauty and truth, the imaginative massaging of real life, in particular with all the tools and techniques of the other genres, poetry, fiction, but also the special characteristics of other genres, such as the use of dialogue, setting, flash forward and back. So this is my chance to give you a broad brush overview of the special qualities of CNF, along with the forms it can take. And I'll just read off some of these forms now, and we'll talk about them a little bit later. There's long form narrative, there's memoir, there's personal essay. There are some of the kind of different and newer forms, manifesto, lyric essay, that are a little more experimental and hybrid. Within these categories, there are also different ways to structure the story being told. For example, in memoir, like Solito, our book in common, we have a narrator who is recounting chronologically and in retrospect a traumatic childhood story of leaving all he knows for a new home. A story told in the present tense, from the point of view of the naive child, with all the urgency and drama of a novel, using dialogue to bolster the truth and the beauty of this immigrant story that took place decades earlier. Or we can have, in another work we're going to talk about, The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion, a melancholy memoir of grieving her husband's death, a narrative set in the past tense, even though in truth, the events that occurred were closer in time to when she wrote it than the first person memoir, Solito. So it's also discursive and expository, philosophical, yet also conversational, and it's brought to life with poetic devices. We're talking about Joan Didion, like repetition, which she uses dramatically all the way through, metaphor, imagery, and reflection. There's not so much reflection in Solito, as those of you who've read it probably already noticed, but Didion's is full of that. So here are two books, two stories, both of them built on truth, that could not be more different from each other in the way they're presented. So yet both are CNF, both indeed are memoirs, each one moving in its own way. Over the 20 plus years that I've been teaching here, teaching CNF at Spalding, I've observed how the CNF genre has changed and evolved. It's become more elastic in its definition. It's grown into a form more expansive, experimental, as I said before, and creative than at the beginning of the debates, which really started, I think, in the 1960s over what exactly CNF encompasses. What CNF does not do, in my opinion, is merely report. It is not traditional journalism. And I was a journalist for 30 years. Though some of its best examples have been published in newspaper magazines, for example. And many of the early CNF stars of new journalism were publishing in more journalistic rather than literary magazines. But it does not encompass autobiography. Although it includes autobiography's distant cousin memoir. So I think this is a good time to actually distinguish these two subgenres, autobiography and memoir. So I'll take as an example, I don't have the book in front of me, but Katharine Graham's personal history. Katharine Graham was married to the publisher of the Washington Post. He died, she took over the job, and then Watergate happened. So this is a book that details her life as a whole, as well as that part that others of us know more about, which was Watergate. It's a good thing to compare it to Joan Didion's memoir of the aftermath of her husband's death in the Year of Magical Thinking. One is a straightforward chronological narrative packed with indisputable facts, Googleable events, historical events, things that can be checked out. While the other, Joan Didion's, reads like a lyric poem nestled inside the rhythms of a novel, cloaked in the remembered dialogue of a reconstructed memory. So they're very different forms. All of it is told intimately from the specific sensibility, this is Didion, of a skeptical, sometimes cynical, always opinionated first-person female narrator. So while Graham strives for objectivity, despite her obvious biases, which we all have, Didion embraces her personal perspective. As a former newspaper reporter, I respect and enjoy reading books like Graham's autobiography, an exacting autobiography. But what we are talking about today is what Didion's memoir does. Not academic writing, not biography or history or autobiography, not journalism, creative nonfiction. So the term itself evolved out of the conversation among newspapers and magazine writers, and their desire to forego efforts to be objective and to admit, indeed benefit from, as writers, their own personal perspectives. In truth, this is a more honest approach to writing CNF. It was dubbed the new journalism and gave rise to a more authentic literary nonfiction that pushed the boundaries and was pursued by writers like Truman Capote, Tom Wolfe, Hunter Thompson, Norman Mailer, Gay Talese, and of course, Joan Didion. This may have been when memoir first began to evolve into a more literary kind of writing. There were certainly exceptions, but this is when it began en masse. So let's talk about memoir. It is one of the CNF forms that has exploded even more than others during the time that I've been teaching. It was once written or ghostwritten, it still is, but it was primarily written or ghostwritten for celebrities, people that you already knew a lot about. It's now more likely authored by people whose own stories were once ignored, whose lives were unknown, certainly not considered worthy of being published. People with disabilities, for example, people who have been abused physically, psychologically, politically, people whose stories are buried beneath the rubble of war, people grieving, birthing, dying, coming out, transforming, people writing about one stage of their lives or one theme of their lives or one relationship that has changed their lives. So memoir is a good place also for us to start because it does not pretend to be the whole truth and nothing but the truth. It is that ephemeral thing called recollection, which we all know is not irrefutable fact. It's shaded by time, by experience. It accepts the truth sometimes is most authentically exposed via the use of literary license. Memoir can be told in first person, and most often is, but it can be written in second or third. Again, the flexibility of CNF. Carmen Maria Machado's memoir, In the Dream House, which we'll be looking at a little later, is a direct address to the you. It's in second person. And that address is sometimes to the reader and sometimes to herself, the writer. And it's broken down into 1 or 2 page riffs written in second person. The voice is one of flint and grit, spoken by an abused but healing victim. And then there is another memoir to compare that to, which is Joseph Anton, a memoir, which is Salman Rushdie's memoir of going underground during the fatwa against him, which tells his own story in third person, but gives the protagonist himself a made-up name. And the name is taken, it's Joseph Anton, is taken from the 2 writers he most admired, Conrad and Chekhov. So this flexibility in memoir, you can use different voices, you can tell it in the past, present. This flexibility isn't a random evolution, I don't think. I think it comes about as our culture comes to terms with the unknowable, the nonlinear nature of experience, the way we turn it over in our minds until it becomes a memory, a story, a personal myth, a constructed certainty. A memoir allows creativity. In fact, it demands imagination, even as it expresses the ambiguities of truth. I think of British author Julian Barnes' memoir, Nothing to be Frightened of, which I recommend, and how he releases himself from any reader's expectation of absolute truth by occasionally and affably bringing his brother into the story to give his own differing opinion of the things that Julian is talking about in the family, the nuclear family he grew up in. I've often thought of this technique as really an elegant way of dealing with the fact that each of us processes and therefore remembers events from our own particular perspective. I'm sure you've all experienced that with your own families. So this brings to mind the last lines of Keats' Grecian Urn poem about truth and beauty, that it is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. One of the first massaged, I'll say, memoirs that I remember reading and thinking about in literary terms is Tobias Wolff's This Boy's Life, a memoir, whose title indicates that it is a story straight out of the author's life, and it is. But as Wolff himself states in the book, and this is a quote, "This is a book of memory, and memory has its own story to tell, but I've done my best to make it tell a truthful story." By the way, in this lecture, I'll be mentioning 3 different wolves, all of whom spell their names different ways. So beware. So Woolf's memoir, which was written in 1989, reads like a novel. The characters are fully developed. There's a plot. And reality drives the story. But imagination and his own reflection on what happened and what he omits and what he enhances fuel that journey. So I want to also point out that my examples on the handout are focused on memoir. And I did that partly because Javier Zamora's memoir is our CNF book in common, but also because today I feel memoir perhaps encompasses the elements of all other CNF. It's the personal essay on steroids. It can be made up of combined pieces of flash nonfiction and can reflect all the other subgenres I mentioned earlier. It can include poetry as far as that goes, and stage directions, film dialogue, fictional settings. I've seen all of this in CNF. But here's a sample from Machado, which you can read from your handout. I'm going to read it to you. So she is the author of 2 novels, a winner of the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Prize, and a Guggenheim Fellow. Her widely imaginative memoir of a relationship gone bad, chapter by chapter, turns from funny to melancholic, but always is mesmerizing. The book has been described as exploding what we think a memoir can be. And that memoir is called The Dream House. And so everything is divided up into sections, some very, very brief, with titles that are like Dream House as not a metaphor, Dream House as utopia, Dream House as whatever. So I'm going to start with Dream House as not a metaphor, which is on page 1 of your handout. I dare say you've heard of the Dream House. It is, as you know, a real place. It stands upright. It is next to a forest and at the rim of sward. It has a foundation, though rumors of the dead buried within it are almost certainly a fiction. There used to be a swing dangling from a tree branch, but now it's just a rope with a single knot swaying in the wind. You may have heard stories about the landlord, but I assure you they are untrue. After all, the landlord is not a man, but an entire university, a tiny city of landlords. Can you imagine? So the story of this book is her living with another woman and what happened in this house. Most of your assumptions are correct. It has floors and walls and windows and a roof. If you are assuming that there are 2 bedrooms, you are both right and wrong. Who is to say that there are only 2 bedrooms? Every room can be a bedroom. You only need a bed, or not even that. You only need to sleep there. The inhabitant gives the room its purpose. Your actions are mightier than any architect's intentions. I bring this up because it is important to remember that the dream house is real. So throughout the book, she uses the dream house as both a metaphor and a reality. It is as real as the book you're holding in your hands, though significantly less terrifying. If I cared to, I could give you its address and you could drive there in your own car and sit in front of that dream house and try to imagine the things that have happened inside. I wouldn't recommend it. You could, no one would stop you. So I want to read next from Joan Didion's memoir, which has chapters of varying lengths, but it is not as stylized as Machado's structure. It's very creative, but Machado's structure, as I pointed out, has titles for that kind of form, they're kind of repetition themselves, and Didion's is more of a normal book structure. She's a journalist, she died recently, memoirist, narrative nonfiction writer, screenwriter, playwright, and novelist. She wrote The Year of Magical Thinking 1 year after the death of her husband, as I've mentioned, the writer John Gregory Dunn. in nonfiction forms that range from traditional narrative to list to diary excerpts to lines worthy of a poem, she writes this book. And that should be on your handout on page 5. You can see how different this is, and yet very, very imaginative. Number 5, chapter 1. 1. Life changes fast. Life changes in the instant. You sit down to dinner and life as you know it ends. The question of self-pity. Those were the first words I wrote after it happened. The computer dating on the Microsoft Word file, parens, notes unchanged doc, reads May 20th, 2004, 11:11 p.m. But that would have been a case of my opening the file and reflexively pressing save when I closed it. I had made no changes to that file in May. I had made no changes to that file since I wrote the words in January 2004, a day or 2 or 3 after the fact being her husband's death. For a long time, I wrote nothing else. Life changes in the instant, the ordinary instant. And in case you don't have your, I don't know if you can see that, but even the way it's written on the page, it's very interesting to see. It's not like typical narrative. At some point, in the interest of remembering what seemed most striking about what had happened, I considered adding these words, the ordinary instant. But I saw immediately that there would be no need to add the word ordinary because there would be no forgetting it. The word never left my mind. It was, in fact, the ordinary nature of everything preceding the event that prevented me from truly believing it had happened. That is the death. Absorbing it, incorporating it, getting past it. I recognize now that there was nothing unusual in this. Confronted with sudden disaster, we all focus on how unremarkable the circumstances were in which the unthinkable occurred. The clear blue sky from which the plane fell, the routine errand that ended on the shoulder with the car in flames, the swings where the children were playing as usual when the rattlesnake struck from the ivy. Quote, he was on his way home from work, happy, successful, healthy, and then gone. I read in the account of a psychiatric nurse whose husband was killed in a highway accident. In 1966, I happened to interview many people who had been living in Honolulu on the morning of December 7th, 1941. Without exception, these people began their accounts of Pearl Harbor by telling me what an ordinary Sunday morning it had been. It was just an ordinary, beautiful September day, people still say when they are asked to describe the morning in New York, when American Airlines 11 and United Airlines 175 got flown into the World Trade Center. Even the report of the 9/11 Commission opened on this insistently premonitory and yet still dumbstruck narrative note, quote, from the Commission report. Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, dawn temperate and nearly cloudless in the eastern United States. And then gone. In the midst of life, we are in death, Episcopalians say at the graveside. Later, I realized that I must have repeated the details of what happened to everyone who came to the house in those first weeks, all those friends and relatives who brought food and made drinks and laid our plates out on the dining room table for however many people were around at lunch or dinner time, all those who picked up the plates and froze the leftovers and ran the dishwasher and filled our, I could not yet think my, otherwise empty house, even after I had gone into the bedroom, our bedroom, the one in which there still lay on a sofa a faded terry cloth size XL robe bought in the 1970s at Richard Carroll in Beverly Hills, and shut the door. Those moments when I was abruptly overtaken by exhaustion are what I remember most clearly about the first days and weeks. I have no memory of telling anyone the details, but I must have done so because everyone seemed to know them. At one point, I considered the possibility that they had picked up the details of the story from one another, but immediately rejected it. The story they had was in each instant too accurate to have been passed from hand to hand. It had come from me. The other reason I knew that the story had come from me was that no version I heard included the details I could not face. For example, the blood on the living room floor. It stayed there until Jose came the next morning and cleaned it up. I'm going to stop there. So this is the story of a death, the same of a husband, the same way that Catherine Graham's is, but hers does not go into that kind of detail and thought and using the kind of language that Dianne uses. One is CNF and one is autobiography. So Machado displayed innovation in form, and Dianne takes fearless stock of herself. Both of those are hallmarks of creative nonfiction. There's a distinct vulnerability that both narrators expose to the reader too. You do not find that in Graham's autobiography. I believe that either of these excerpts could stand alone with just a little tinkering. They could be flash nonfiction. They could be personal essays, but they're part of a whole, and the whole is memoir. Yet personal essays predate full-length memoirs by about 2 millennia. Seneca, born about the time of Christ, authored his essays in the first year AD. He wrote with intimacy, which according to the editor and writer Philip Lopate, who has written this book, which I highly recommend, The Art of the Personal Essay. Lopate says that intimacy is one of the hallmarks of the personal essay, and I think it is of any enough. But Seneca's topics ranged from the aggravation of noise, his own asthma, to slavery. Shawnigan, writing in 10th century Japan, just decried in one essay about hateful things, including scurrying mice and a newcomer to her group who pushes ahead of the other members, or the sound of dogs when they bark for a long time. So don't worry when they tell you that contemporary CNF is overwrought with whining and 21st century complaints. It's a tradition. It belongs to CNF. Shawnigan, by the way, is an outlier as a woman essayist. Not until the 20th century did women partake of the personal essay in large numbers. It was with the advent of feminism that women writers began to branch out of the to the intimate essay and away from less revealing world, the less self-revealing world of novels and drama and, say, poetry. And by the way, this 700-page tome that The Art of the Essay that Lopate wrote is a must-have if you want to really understand the history and the evolution of the essay. We have lyric essays, which became popular among writers in the early part of this century. I have been described as writing that straddles the essay and the lyric poem. It's a hybrid. These poetic essays or essayistic poems emphasize artfulness over the transmission of facts. Their focus is not on narrative or narrative line or logic or persuasion, but rather they lean into quirky, eccentric musings and meditations. The Seneca Review was a literary journal that pushed in the 1990s, the late 1990s, pushed this new form into the consciousness of writers and MFA programs. So think of Machado's riffs in her memoir, Dianne's punchy, edgy, elusive pieces of prose that feel like poetry. And again, you see this overlap. Helen Vendler, who some of you may know was a well-known editor, she has written of the lyric poem that it, quote, depends on gaps. It is suggestive rather than exhaustive. It uses association, leaping from thought to image and back to thought. Connoting with juxtaposition. It's short usually and distilled. It can wander using the techniques of fiction, drama, and film. And there have been some beautiful books based on lyric essays. Dianne's individual chapters in her memoir read like lyric essays to me. For example, they possess the attributes of this elliptical language and also highly idiosyncratic storytelling, not what you're used to. So now let's read from our handout, another writer, memoirist, poet, Joy Harjo, and that's on page 4. Joy Harjo is a writer of the Creek Nation. She served 3 terms as the 23rd U.S. Poet Laureate from 2019 to 2022. She's the winner of awards in poetry, the Yale 2023 Ballingen Prize, I'm not sure I pronounced that right, Poetry Society of America, Lifetime Achievement Awards, and the National Book Critics, a Guggenheim, many, many awards. Her memoir, Crazy Brave, which is one of 2 memoirs she's written, details her journey to becoming a poet. So let's read that. It begins, east is the direction of beginnings. It is sunrise. When beloved sun rises, it is an entrance, a door to fresh knowledge. Breathe the light in. Call upon the assistance you need for the day. Give thanks. East is how the plants, animals, and other beings orient themselves for beginnings to open and blossom. The spirit of the day emerges from the sunrise point. East is also the direction of Oklahoma, where I was born, the direction of the Creek Nation. Once I was so small I could barely see over the top of the back seat of the black Cadillac my father bought with his Indian oil money. He polished and tuned his car daily. I wanted to see everything. This was around the time I acquired language, when something happened that changed my relationship to the spin of the world. It changed even the way I looked at the sun. This suspended integer of time probably escaped ordinary notice in my parents' universe, which informed most of my vision in the ordinary world. They were still omnipresent gods. We were driving somewhere in Tulsa, the northern border of the Creek Nation. I don't know where we were going or where we had been, but I know the sun was boiling the asphalt. The car windows were open for any breeze as I stood on tiptoes on the floorboard behind my father, a handsome god who smelled of Old Spice, whose slick back hair was always impeccably groomed, his clothes perfectly creased and ironed. The radio was on. Even then, I loved the radio, jukeboxes, or any magic thing containing music. I wonder what signaled this moment, a loop of time that on first glance could be any place in time. I became acutely aware of the line the jazz trumpeter was playing, a sound I later associated with Miles Davis. I didn't know the words jazz or trumpet. I don't know how to say it with what sounds or words, but in that confluence of hot southern afternoon and the breeze of aftershave and humidity, I followed that sound to the beginning, to the birth of sound. I was suspended in whirling stars. I grieved my parents' failings, my own life, which I saw stretching the length of that rhapsody. My rite of passage into the world of humanity occurred then through jazz. The music was a startling bridge between familiar and strange lands. I heard stomp dance shells singing. I saw suits, satins, fine hats. I heard workers singing in the fields. It was a way to speak beyond the confines of ordinary language. I still hear it. I think that is so beautiful. And one of the things that I want to emphasize in all of these pieces, but you get it here particularly, is the amount of detail and scene setting that takes place in kind of gritty form. You can see it, you can hear it, you can smell it. Let's move on then. We were talking about the different forms that the CNF can take. There are hermit crab essays, those that take the form of quizzes, grocery lists, recipes, litanies, to-do lists. These are not your English comp teacher's idea of an essay, but I noticed Nancy McCabe is here, and she's done such a wonderful job using these kind of forms, both as standalones and as part of a book. Her book, Can This Marriage Be Saved, comes to mind. It employs many different forms, including how-to essays, before and after weight loss ads, a curriculum guide, Bible study notes, women's magazine columns, and quizzes, all in the service of examining the many influences that led to her own early marriage and a divorce. So here is CNF wrapped up in originality and good humor, style, informing content. And don't forget braided essays. Those are the essays that are woven with strands of often unrelated meditations. I know you're familiar with them, but I love the way the juxtaposition of the threads makes something even richer out of the individual pieces. And then there are collage essays, which are among my favorites. I particularly like to teach groups of students by using collage art, which is, of course, always butting up, pieces of it are butting up against each other to create new meaning, with collage writing, which does the same kind of thing. Each collage piece is like a puzzle piece. And once you plug it in, it changes what is surrounding it. I think it feels to me like it works the way life does, the way the mind makes sense of each and every experience by joining one to the other, by comparing, by thinking about and contrasting and finding connection. There are also manifestos. An example of a CNF book that is written in the form of a manifesto is David Shields' Reality Hunger. Each chapter is a numbered list of meditations, kind of on a theme. Not all of these paragraphs written by Shields. He very controversially took different people's writing and mixed it in with his own, all these numbered paragraphs, and didn't want to say who had written the other ones. And I have to say they flow quite nicely together. But finally, at his publisher and lawyer's encouragement, he included the names of the people whose work he had borrowed in the back of the book. But his belief is that what's written becomes part of the culture and therefore can be included in another author's writing. That is a debate for another lecture. Flash fiction is another popular form in CNF. Flash nonfiction. Skim the internet and you'll find contests, and journals, and anthologies that encourage these brief but powerful and intimate, usually, pieces that depend on concision and association. Norton, the publisher, for example, published several anthologies edited by well-known writers like Judith Kitchen and Diti Moore. Though I've not mentioned it yet, you may have noticed that contemporary poets in particular are often drawn to these hybrid forms and to memoir. I think it's again one of these overlap areas. So Harjo was a US poet laureate. So was Ocean Vuong. He's a Vietnamese American poet, an essayist, and a novelist. He is the recipient of many awards also from many of the same places that Harjo has earned her awards. After leaving Vietnam, his homeland, during the war, he and his family lived in poverty for a time in a refugee camp in the Philippines before being admitted to the US. Vuong was 2 years old, so he wrote this much later. And I want to read briefly from that memoir. It's number 2 on page 1. On Earth, we're briefly gorgeous. A woman not yet, and this takes place during war. A woman not yet 30 clutches her daughter on the shoulder of a dirt road in a beautiful country where 2 men, M16s in their hands, step up to her. She's at a checkpoint, a gate made of concertina and weaponized permission. Behind her, the fields have begun to catch, a braid of smoke through a page blank sky. One man has black hair, the other a yellow mustache like a scar of sunlight. Stench of gasoline coming off their fatigues. The rifles sway as they walk up to her, their metal bolts winking in afternoon sun. A woman, a girl, a gun. This is an old story. one anyone can tell, a trope in a movie you can walk away from if it weren't already here, already written down. It had started to rain. The dirt around the woman's bare feet is flecked with red-brown quotation marks. Her body a thing spoken with. Her white shirt clings against her bony shoulders as she sweats. The grass all around her is flattened, as if God had pressed his hand there, reserving a space for an eighth day. It's a beautiful country, she's been told, depending on who you are. It's not a god, of course, but a helicopter, a Huey, another lord whose winds so heavy that a few feet away, a lint gray warbler thrashes in the high grass, unable to correct herself. The girl's eye fills with the chopper in the sky, her face a dropped peach, her blue shawl finally made visible with black ink, like this. Somewhere deep inside this beautiful country, in the back of a garage lit with a row of fluorescent lights, as legend has it, 5 men have gathered around a table. Beneath their sandaled feet, pools of motor oil reflect nothing. On the end of the table, a cluster of glass bottles. The vodka inside them shimmers in the harsh light as the men talk, their elbows shifting impatiently. They fall silent each time one of them glances toward the door. It should open any time now. The light flickers once, stays on. The vodka poured into shot glasses, some ringed with rust from being stored in a metal bullet case from the previous war. The heavy glasses thunk on the table, the burn swallowed into a darkness invented by thirst. If I say woman, if I say the woman is bearing down, her back hunched below this man-made storm, would you see her? From where you are standing, inches, which is to say years from this page, would you see the shred of blue shawl blowing across her collarbone? The mole at the outside corner of her left eye as she squints at the men, who are now close enough for her to realize they are not men at all, but boys, 18, 20 at most. Can you hear the sound of the chopper? Its dismemberment of air so loud it drowns the shouting beneath it. The wind coarse with smoke, and something else, a sweat-soaked char. Its odd and acrid taste blowing from a hut at the end of the field, a hut that moments ago was filled with human voices. It goes on to talk more about the blue shawl that has been blown apart. And I'll skip here. The olive tag stitched to the boy's chest frames a word. This is the boy with the gun. Although the woman cannot read it, she knows it signals a name, something given by a mother or father, something weightless yet carried forever, like a heartbeat. She knows the first letter in the name is C, like in Gokong, the name of the open-air market she had visited 2 days ago. Its neon marquee buzzing at the entrance. She was there to buy a new shawl for the girl. The cloth had cost more than what she had planned to spend, but when she saw it, day bright among the gray and brown bolts, she peered up at the sky, even though it was already nightfall, and paid, knowing there would be nothing left to eat with, sky blue. So, this is history, but it's not written like history. It's written with the all the technique and tools and abilities of the poet that he is. So I also want to point out that you could conduct a search for what genre this particular book fits into, and you would find critics and the author himself offering many possible categories: a novel, autofiction, memoir, semi-autobiography, epistolary. It is written as a letter to his mother, among others. What it boils down to is a book based on traumatic, true experience, written with the sensibility and skill of poet. I'm reminded again of Keats, who was the poet who in 1817 coined the term negative capability, referring to the ability of us as human beings to accept uncertainty, doubt, and mystery without seeking immediate answers or explanations. And in a sense, I feel that that's what some nonfiction, creative nonfiction is. It's hard to nail it down. Here, composing creative nonfiction, the author tempers the violent yet truthful acts of life with the mercy and grace of sounds, language, image, symbol, details, the beauty of art. This is what draws me to CNF, the way it can deepen our knowledge of the world, its people, ourselves. It's a way to be drawn into others' lives and minds through actual events and encounters, as well as their artful reconstruction. So just to remind you of a few of the things that stand out for me in Ocean Vuong's writing. The image, the sound of the chopper is dismemberment of air so loud it drowns out the shouting beneath it. That's a beautiful line because it foretells, it's dismembering the air, but people are being dismembered too. The girl's eyes fill with the chopper in the sky, her face a dropped peach. And their gap teeth like mouthfuls of dice. That was a part that didn't reach you. But these are not sentences out of a newspaper story or descriptions in a history book. This is what creative nonfiction can do to the facts. Things are not spelled out. Rather, they arrive like a code we learn to translate as the narrative continues. So let's now go to Solito, and this is not on the handout, but Zamora's book, which is, like Vuong's, a story of a lost homeland and a new life, but it focuses on the peculiarities of the journey, a long and frightening one from Salvador to the US. So I'm just going to quote a little bit from close to the beginning. I'll be back soon, mijo. I'll come back as I promised. Mom said 4 years ago in this very room. The room was a pale indigo, the walls dark, the sun beginning to rise, light hitting the tops of the pink and white myrtle trees outside this window by the bed I shared with her. My eyes were half closed, but I remember Mom kissing the top of my head, then both my cheeks. She made a cross on my forehead with her fingers, whispered something to herself. Then she kneeled next to the bed and looked me right in my eyes and told me, "Te quiero mucho." I love you very much. I regret not waking up for Mom. I liked watching her get ready when she went out. Mom said she was going to go away for a while, but didn't tell me when or for how long. I had just turned 5. As she stood in the door for a few seconds, I closed my eyes and went back to sleep. What we see here is reflection, a looking back to a time now lost. It's not a usual technique in this memoir, but one that opens the story with a sense of grief and regret and loss, which gives us background for understanding our protagonist as he tried to get home to the mother he misses and needs. As I mentioned earlier, contemporary CNF gives voice to speakers who might not have been heard in the past. So illness memoirs, which I'm going to finish up with, are also something that has grown very popular in recent years. And it's kind of a subgenre. You can look at AWP panels, websites, anthologies. There's a lot about people's personal illnesses. So we're gonna go next to Porchista Hakpour. That's on page 3. She was born in Iran, lived through the revolution, the war that followed, then emigrated at age 3 to the US. She studied at Sarah Lawrence and Johns Hopkins, has written many books. And this one was named one of the best books of the year by Time magazine. And it's on page 3. I have never been comfortable in my own body. Rather, I've felt my whole life that I was born in the wrong body. A slight woman, femme in appearance, olive skin that has varied from dark to light, thick, black, curly hair, large eyes, hands and feet too big, a somewhat more than average height, and somewhat less than average weight. I'm going to skip a little bit. I've looked for answers for my first few years on this earth. Was it early PTSD upon PTSD, marked by revolution and then war and then refugee years. A person without a home, could that have caused it? Was displacement of the body literally causing a feeling of displacement in my body? At some point with chronic illness and disability, I grew to feel at home. My body was wrong, and through data, we could prove that. Because my illness at this stage has no cure, I can forever own this discomfort of the body. I can always say this was all a mistake. To find a home in my body is to tell a story that doesn't exist. I am a foreigner, but in ways that go much deeper than I thought, under the epidermis and into the blood cells. I have started to consider that I will never be at home, perhaps not even in death. Okay. So you can read some of these other pieces on your own here, but what I would like to mention is that Lopate and Montaigne are sort of the gurus of personal essay. Montaigne because he read so many, and Lopate because he has written this wonderful book that includes essays and also explicates them and talks about the way this has all evolved. They have some interesting things to say, and I'm going to just kind of leave you with this. Lopate has said that at the core, this is a quote, at the core of the personal essay, and most CNF, I would add, is the supposition that there is a certain unity to human experience. Montaigne said, every man, and I would add woman, has within himself the entire human condition. Lopate said that of Montaigne, that he might be the first writer, quote, to talk to himself convincingly on the page. We readers feel as if we're eavesdropping. But Lopate goes on to say the essayist must be a reliable narrator, and the exposure of his or her own betrayals and uncertainties gives the writer more authenticity. In the same vein, Montaigne wrote, on the loftiest throne in the world, we are still sitting only on our own rump. He also suggests, Lopate suggests that the personal essay possesses an implicitly democratic bent. I really like that because it values and gives its place, individual experience. About personal essays, Lopate also says, quote, the spectacle of bearing the naked soul is meant to awaken the sympathy of the reader, who is apt to forgive the essayist his self-absorption in return for the warmth of his or her candor. Some vulnerability is essential to the personal essay, and I would say to creative nonfiction. Finally, Lopate in his anthology quotes E.B. White, another popular essayist of his time, on the subject. And what he says, and I'm going to leave you with this, is there is one thing the essayist cannot do. He cannot indulge himself in deceit or in concealment, or he will be found out in no time. And I think we all know of scandals of people who wrote memoirs or personal essays that were not true, that they made up, but they presented them as truth. That backfired. And I think that E.B. White's words should be well heeded. But I leave you with a lot to think about and some things to try and to read. I hope all of this will prepare you for our residency, which will be focusing on CNF. And I hope it will provide you with something new to think about and write about. Thank you.
Thank you, Dianne.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I don't know if there's time for any questions, probably not.
We just have a couple of minutes. So if anybody has a question, speak up now, or you can put it in the chat really quickly.
I have a quick question, but this
Sure.
might be a little bit too much to get into right now, but I'm just curious. Diane, that was so good. I'm so intrigued by memoir. I love the form. And now I really understand the difference between autobiography and memoir. That was really clear. What I don't understand, and I'm curious about, is what's the difference between memoir? What pushes memoir to be nonfiction versus fiction? Like where's the line? And is this like a more existential question about what truth is? Because because can something be what is it? What is at the heart of memoir that makes it
Yeah.
nonfiction rather than fiction? Is it like just personal truth?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is it's true experiences somebody has had and then is writing about. But you're right to question, and there's been a lot of questioning about how much do we really remember of what's happened to us? And if we only remember a little, is it enough to make a reader really want to read it and get something out of it? So I think that's what we're talking about with these writers that I picked for you. Obviously have a memory or have an experience, and they may have great observational skills so that they do remember a lot, but they also have to probably do research. They probably have to find out what kind of tree was in the park when they met the person they're writing about. You know what I mean? There's an ability there's a demand really to enhance with detail and language and music and rhythm and all of those things that we use as writers, but to stick to the truth. And I'll just say this, I think that quote from Julian Barnes is really important, that not the quote, but the example. He realizes that what he thinks about his parents in his family is influenced by many things, and his brother might have a different opinion because his brother grew up at a different time in his parents' relationship. Everything changes for an individual compared to another individual's experience. So I think the main thing is to try to stick to the truth, to the facts, but embellished with literary technique. I think that's the best way I can say it.
Well, thank you. We're almost out of time. I know all essayists and those who write creative nonfiction are often very freed by the conditional. Perhaps this happened, or they would have maybe done this. And there's a wonderful lecture by Jason Howard who sort of brought that all together. I think it's on the, you all can find it if you're interested in that too. So it's something that I'll be talking about as well. So thank you, Diane. This is great. And I look forward to seeing all of you. And thank you for dropping in on your Sunday. And I'll get this posted as soon as possible. And we'll see you soon. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thanks a lot.